because I can start to relate to many of the changes in the history of the papacy because they were so influential on our upbringing and on our lives in the 20th century primarily. The issue was that during the 18th century, nobody in Europe was ready for the French Revolution. Nobody could envision it. The same way as in the 20th century, nobody could envision the threat of communism because it had never occurred anywhere. Russia was the first communist country. So people could predict wild things, but nobody really knew what could happen. The one person who knew the least about what could happen was Pope Pius VI. We have said before that during the 17th, 18th century, most of the popes were compromised with. They were not the best kind, because the rulers of Europe, the kings of Europe, would have veto power. So before a conclave began, they would say, well, I do not want Cardinal so-and-so, and I do not want Cardinal so-and-so, and I do not want Cardinal so-and-so. So the least offensive of those who were left were the ones who became pope. So Pius VI, his name was Count Angelo Braschi, was a nobleman. He came from a noble Italian family. So he had class, he had education, he had noble blood. He was elected after Clement the 14th abolished the Jesuits. The Jesuits always took a beating whenever there was any kind of political change, because they had aligned themselves with one party or the other. And whenever one party fell from grace and the other one took over, the Jesuits were out.
The Jesuits have a lot of inside knowledge about the popes since they work so closely with them, that the new pope coming in would be nervous about in terms of.
All right, I kind of missed half your question.
The reason that they got canned when the new pope came in is that the new pope fear that the Jesuits knew a lot about the various popes and that would be a power struggle.
Well, they knew that the Jesuits knew everything about everybody. And they knew that it was a church within a church with their own power structure. So they were really resented because they were so able. They were so intelligent, so dedicated, so zealous, so pious, but at the same time so worldly. They were the fighters. They were the fighters for the church. So that was the reason why they fell out of favor, because they were constantly feared, for they were so powerful. But Angelo Braschi, who was a descendant of a very noble family, loved the accoutrement of the papacy. Loved the robes, loved the tiara, they loved the stoles, they loved the shoes. He loved the music, the pontifications and the blessings and the coronations, all the peripherals and the visuals. He loved them. No doubt about it. Nevertheless, when he was Pope, he had to face all of these issues that we discussed last week. We talked about Febronianism. We talked about Josephism. One was an attack from within the church. The other one was an attack from the political point of view. He was the one who made the visit to Vienna. that was called the Canassa in reverse. He went there to beg the emperor, emperor, please, lay off. Don't interfere with us anymore. We feel the pressure. Please don't. Then the sin of Pistoia was really another revolution within the church that told the Pope, hey, you don't have to live in Rome. Hey, you don't have to be a king. Hey, you don't have to have civil control over your territories. He tried to open the nunciature in the embassy in Munich, and the archbishops revolted. We don't need a nuncio. We are the archbishops. We can manage things. And the Pope just had to say the nuncio is basically a political figure. You are not a political figure. You're an ecclesiastical figure. You have nothing to fear from the nuncio. Sure. And then the Enlightenment and Gallicanism. So all of these things, Pius VI had already faced, primarily by letting things ride, letting things go, don't antagonize anybody, just look pretty and give a lot of blessings, carry on. Things will go away. The French Revolution came around for many reasons. Primarily, what precipitated it was that the French government of Louis XVI was running out of money. Louis XVI had been waging war with England for a while, and he was just running out of money. He had tried to raise funds here and there, but had not been able to. Part of the problem was the poor distribution of wealth. The church in France owned 10% of the land, but was only less than 1% of the population. In addition, the nobility owned 25% of the real estate, or was less than 1% of the population. The third estate, everybody else, us, paid heavily taxes, carried the burden, really exploded. So there was a major imbalance there in wealth. The third estate, with some clergymen and some nobles, declared itself the National Assembly and went on to abolish feudalism and the tithes, the 10% that everybody paid the church, that was abolished too. They accepted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and nationalized church property, which was sold to generate income. They closed monasteries and convents, and the following year they proclaimed the civil constitution of the clergy. This was necessary because the tithes, the 10%, had been removed. So all of a sudden the church in France went from being quite wealthy to being quite poor, because those monies were going to the government, not to the church. So for that reason, they had to come up with the civil constitution of the church. The civil constitution made the number of bishops lower in order to conform to the district. It would be as if there was a redistribution of land, and every county had its own bishop. One bishop, one county. Now, this is basically what they did in France. They declared that the bishops had to reside in their diocese. You would say, oh, what's the big deal? Well, there were some bishops in France who had never been to their diocese. They were absentee owners. There were some bishops in France that presided over 2 or 3 dioceses, collecting funds from each one of them. So there was again a very bad distribution of property. The civil constitution specified salaries for bishops and priests paid by the state. And this was the major problem, an oath. Bishops and priests and archbishops had to swear that they would do good in the performance of duties. They would be loyal to the king, to France, and to the laws. And finally, and this was the clinching, they had to promise that they would not take orders from a ruler outside of France. And the Pope was exactly that, ruler outside of France. The Pope was a king. He was the king of the Papal States. So therefore, the civil constitution of the clergy was defiant of the powers of the papacy. The Pope being a king is by himself. Well, Pope Pius VI, he was not good at what we call crisis management. He was totally overwhelmed about the French Revolution and the civil constitution of the clergy and the oath. And he decided just to keep quiet, continue with a low profile, maybe it'll go away. Well, it didn't. So after about a year or two of what they call immense silent patience, he condemned the civil constitution of the clergy and, while he was at it, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The priests, bishops, and archbishops in France were then classified in 2 factions. One, there were juror priests, the one who took the oath, and the ones who did not take the oath, they were refractories. The ones who were jurors were forbidden to teach or preach, and they could not administer the sacraments. So taking communion, for example, from a juror priest was a mortal sin. On the other hand, refractory priests, the ones who would not take the oath, were persecuted or exiled. So it was a no-win, no-win situation for the priests in France. At that time, Napoleon was fighting the Austrians in northern Italy and had annexed the northern part of the Papal States. Remember the Papal States that zigzagged through Central Europe from Rome to Bologna to Emilia-Romagna, that area. Well, those territories were annexed to the Cisalpine Republic. In any event, the Roman Republic was proclaimed in 1798, and although Napoleon did not order it, the Pope was taken prisoner and sent to France by the French troops. In France, he was humiliated over and over and over again by being kept in a prison while he thought of himself as a king, and also being called citizen pope, not Pope Pius or Your Holiness or whatever. He was called citizen pope over and over and over again, particularly by the guards in prison, who apparently took great pleasure in calling him citizen pope. Napoleon eventually overthrew the directory and became first consul. But Citizen Pope died in 1799. Now, this Wolfish Pope, who had done nothing all his life as Pope, except to wait around, hoping that things would go away, not facing any crisis, just enjoying the pomp and circumstance of the papacy. At the very end of his life, Citizen Pope makes a decision that saves the papacy. When he's about to die in France, everybody in Europe thought that Pius VI would be the last pope. After being taken prisoner from the Vatican, being shipped to France, being kept in a prison, deprived of all his nobility and royalty, and being addressed as Citizen Pope, this was the end of the papacy. Remember that, according to tradition, wherever the Pope died, that was where the next conclave would meet. This would be in France, if the Pope died in France. But the cardinals didn't want to go to France and get imprisoned to like the Pope. No way. France was not a friendly country to the church at that time. So Pius VI, on his deathbed, he says, gentlemen, when I die and you get together to elect a new pope, the most senior of the cardinals decides where you are going to meet. In other words, it doesn't have to be in France. It can be anywhere. Where could that be? Well, how about Venice? Venice was under imperial control. It belonged to the empire. It did not belong to any of the other kings. So it was safe for the cardinals to travel to Venice and assemble. After being liberated from the traditional rule of holding a conclave in the location of the Pope's death, the cardinals went to Venice. Here's the Customs building and Santa Maria della Salute. This, is the Grand Canal. And this is the Lido back here. That's where they have the film festival. So if what did we do here? If you stand right here at St. Mark's Square and you look straight out this way, you will see the island where San Giorgio Maggiore Basilica stands together with the other campanillas. This is not St. Mark's Square. No, this is San Giorgio Maggiore. And this is where the cardinals met in the year 1800. And they elected Pope Pius VII. Safely and securely. They probably had a couple of nice dinners too, and then went home very happy. As soon as Pope Pius VII returned to Rome, even though most of Rome was in the hands of the French, he decided to make contact with Napoleon and send some of his best diplomats to France to make peace with Napoleon. And the message was, look, Napoleon, we need to stop this business of fighting each other. Most of Frenchmen are Catholic. We don't want to interfere in your business, in your government. Please don't interfere with ours. Let's find some common ground. They therefore met and arrived at the Concordat or agreements of 1801. The Concordat of 1801 between Napoleon and the papacy saved time. It made time for both parties to recover from the first French Revolution. It did not solve all the problems of the French church, but it provided a framework for further discussion. It bought them time, which was needed. So the Concordat practically ended the constitutional church and the oath. The oath was no longer necessary. Catholicism was not going to be the state religion. Jews and Protestants maintained the civil rights. The papacy had the power to remove bishops, and the organic articles were added unilaterally by Napoleon. There were some specifics here and there that were really secondary. But the basic thing was that the Concordat forced both parties to stand down a bit. Let's not harp on each other as much. All right. The church will appoint the bishops and the state will approve the bishops. Yeah, we'll continue to pay salaries. You stay away from politics. So they bought themselves some time. In 1804, Pius VII was invited by Napoleon to come to Paris, which was a trip, quite a trip from going to Rome through the Alps into France. And those were the years before railroads were working in continent for Napoleon's coronation. But by that time, Pius VII had refused to close the papal ports to British shipping. You remember from your world-class history in high school how Napoleon proposed a continental system. And the continental system was supposed to close the ports of Europe to shipping from England. And that way, England would be brought to its knees in front of the French Empire. So Pope Pius VII said, no, Napoleon, we're not going to close Civitavecchia or any of the other ports because we're neutral. The papal states are neutral. We're not with you, we're not with them. So the ports remain open. Well, Napoleon didn't like that much. So French troops eventually annexed the papal states in 1809, for which Pius VII excommunicated all involved. Without Napoleon's approval or consent, Pius VII was arrested and confined in Savona, which is in northern Italy nowadays. So that's two popes in a row that have been arrested and taken out of Italy. So it had not been his idea to arrest the pope. Napoleon was a Catholic. He did not like the political aspect of the papacy, but he understood that the Catholic religion as such needed a top figure like the Pope. So Pius agreed to Napoleon's nomination for bishops. In other words, the state will nominate the bishops and the church will confirm them. Now, Pius did not annul Napoleon's marriage to Josephine, and that really ticked Napoleon off. And when he married Maria Luisa of Austria, 13 cardinals did not show up to the wedding. In fury, Napoleon forbade them to wear their red vestments. They could only wear the black satan. Is that how is it? SOUTA and then E, satan, the black garments.
Great.
Yes, satan. Did I pronounce that? Mispronounce it? Okay, fine. Anyway, they could only dress in black. The 13 cardinals that did not attend the wedding. And those were the black cardinals. Pius VII was moved around France until he was eventually lodged at Fontainebleau, not far from Paris. History has it that it is very likely that Pius VII may have been plotting against Napoleon with the British. And for that reason, the French considered him dangerous. That was one of the reasons why they brought him closer to the king in France, to isolate him from British influence. There seems to be pretty good reason to believe that that was the case. That somehow he was in cahoots with the British at that time. It's just a little detail. This is a portrait of Pius VII by Sir Thomas Lawrence, 1819. It's in Windsor Castle. Now, who could be a bigger enemy of the Church of England than the Pope of Rome? Then on the other hand, here's his portrait in Windsor Castle. In other words, they must have been on very friendly terms at that time. Just a little detail. Finally, modern history tries to paint this terrible picture of Napoleon, particularly after he became emperor. He tried again and again and again to correct the problems with the Catholic Church and the papacy in France. If you read the history books, many of them claim that the Pope was mistreated at Fontainebleau. Well, the Pope could have the visits of the black cardinals. He had his own suite of rooms. He was treated respectfully. He was visited by Napoleon. Napoleon went to him, not had him taken Napoleon. They say that Napoleon abused him verbally and physically. He may have. Maybe, maybe not. We see verbal abuse on television every day, so to speak. So, but they came to an agreement eventually. They conquered that of Fontainebleau. The papacy would operate from France and Italy and maintain diplomatic representation. So the papacy was not limited just to Rome. The papacy could move to Italy. Just the same thing as Febronianism had maintained that the Pope did not have to stay in Rome. Agents of the papacy would administer some territories. Napoleon would give the papacy 2 million francs in restitution. That was a lot of money at that time. All bishops except those from Rome to be nominated by the emperor. Going back to the original premise, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome can appoint the other bishops in Rome. But all the other bishops are appointed by the emperor. In other words, you take care of your diocese, we'll take care of the rest. Now, if not installed, they could be consecrated by the metropolitan archbishop. In other words, the bishops that the state would nominate, that the emperor would nominate, were to be approved by the papacy. If the papacy did not, after 6 months, the metropolitan, the number of dioceses in several places like Genoa, Tuscany, and Holland was to be decreased. The black cardinals would be restored to their red robes, and the Pope would move with the Curia to Paris to be close to the emperor and to be cushioned from the influence of the British. Finally, and this is a big deal, the papal archives and other agencies would travel wherever the Pope went.
So, a question about this. How the emperor would nominate the bishops. Does that mean that Napoleon essentially had power which exceeded the borders of France and practically entered the Roman emperor?
What would happen would be, yes, that's a good question. What would happen is, same thing that happens in China. The government gets advice from a number of parties and selects a number of bishops. Those bishops have to be approved by the Pope, by the papacy. If the papacy does not approve of a certain bishop, after 6 months, he can be consecrated by the metropolitan archbishop, independent of Rome. So both, it's a question of balancing. And the concordat of Franklin was a good-natured attempt at trying to balance things between the power of the emperor and the power of the papacy. And this is basically the same thing that is happening in China nowadays, where the bishops are being nominated or appointed by the state.
Yes, but then this is within China, but this concordat actually gave him power over the territories that he would not control.
Yes,
Even places where he would not.
exactly. That's the emperor. That's certainly the emperor.
Yes.
So Napoleon, as we said, he really tried his best over a period of many years to bring the Catholic Church and the papacy within the French Revolution. He tried to find common ground. He realized that Catholicism was the primary religion of the citizens of France. He realized that by losing the tithes, the church had lost a lot, that it had become a very, very poor church. Some bishops lived like kings. On the other hand, some parish priests were basically starving because their diocese did not have any income. He tried his very best. He was a Catholic himself, but he needed more and more and more time. Eventually, with the French republics, the issue of church and state was resolved. But he tried his very best. If we read books, particularly the books that we read in high school, world history, the image of Napoleon that is painted is rather different than it actually was.
So, excuse me, at that point, you already have Catholics here in
Yeah.
US. So, Napoleon was the one appointing, I don't know whether there were bishops at that point.
Yes, there were bishops.
So,
Yeah.
chosen by Napoleon.
Bishops here in the US.
No, Napoleon, you've been in the United States.
Maryland
Yes.
was the first Catholic.
No, they were appointed by the papacy.
No, because by the Concordat, it says that the emperor will.
But If he was emperor of North America, yes.
But that was previously my question. So only on the territories what he would rule, not everywhere.
Yeah, and then he went into Poland and Russia and came back with his tail between his legs. And he had enough problems with other things that he could not bother anymore with the Catholic Church.
Okay.
That's why he put the Pope at Fontainebleau.
Yeah.
And there he was safe. There he would not organize an ecumenical council. He could not give strong orders. He was under control. That's fine. That was enough for them. So I would invite you to read about Napoleon. Maybe revise your opinions. The Congress of Vienna was assembled by the kings of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, actually before the last Napoleonic War, before Waterloo, to decide what to do with Europe after Napoleon was subdued. The end result was that most of the papal states were returned to the Pope. So the Pope ended up with just about as much territory that he had before. Avignon and the Renaissance, those territories in the south of France that we have enjoyed so much, were not returned to the Pope. They'll stay within the Kingdom of France. Pius VII had returned to Rome from Fontainebleau, and he restored the Society of Jesus. Why? He probably needed some strong men looking after him. And good advice.
These were Jesuits.
Yeah, that's the term, yeah,
Jesuits.
right, society.
So he dealt with the Freemasons, the Carbonari, and other secret societies. The Carbonari were one of the secret societies of the 19th century that were primarily arsonists. They set fires, and that's how those were the original arsonists. The Freemasons were also feared. Can you imagine why? Why would the Freemasons be feared?
Because of the Jesuits, because they were restored, so.
So the Jesuits hated them. Why would they hate them? Where does the word free come from? Freemasons.
We talked about this in the last class.
They were free in the sense that they were able to move from site to site in Europe. They were not localized to one country or one location. So they were free to move around. Now, the Masons were the architects and the builders of all the buildings in Europe. So they knew everything. They had the plans to every single building.
All the secret
They
passageways.
knew where people slept. They knew where people ate. They knew where the gold was. They knew where the arms were. They knew where they kept their water. They knew where friends came in and out. They knew the secret passageways.
You heard me.
If you, AOL today had an article on how they have discovered a secret passageway of the Queen of England to one of the hotels in London, which came as a surprise to me because when I was there about 6 years ago, it was very well known. That's where the Queen came for private lunches. That its own private area, a tunnel, wine cellar, and private dining rooms. So they knew exactly where the escape routes were. They had all the details, and that's why they were feared. Because they had that very, very valuable intelligence to just about every building in Europe. So the Pope dealt with all of these, with the Freemasons and the Carbonari, and of course, the Illuminati were also part of this secret society. So they were all excommunicated and decimated by the papacy. In the early 19th century, there were 3 popes between the Congress of Vienna and the middle of the century, all of which were very monarchists. That is, they believed on the Pope being a king. Small kingdom, but still a king. Leo the 12th was austere, very conservative. Pius the 8th condemned the Freemasons and also the Bible translators. The modern translators. It didn't say very much about the ancient translators that translated, for example, the epistles of St. Paul from Greek to Latin. And we all know how much is lost in translation. And then Gregory the 16th. Gregory the 16th was a piece of work. He was ultra-conservative, traditionalist, and anti-democratic. He was even opposed to gaslighting and the construction of railways. He wrote against liberalism and freedom of conscience. He opposed railways because he said that building railroads would empower the common peasants, the common people, and they would rise against the church. Kind of stretching the imagination, but so Gregory the 16th was really something else. Then we come to probably the most important individual in the papacy of the 19th century, Pio Pope Pius the 9th. He was elected in 1846 at the age of 54. So he was more or less the same age as John Paul II was when he was elected. He was considered a liberal and was described as being, and this is a quote from a contemporary source, as being glamorous, ardent, generous, emotional, pious, progressive, friendly, heathen, and intellectual. He was also, in his youth, quite handsome. Nowadays, he would probably try to lose some weight, but that was okay at that time. It did not affect his image much. The thing is that Pius IX, when he was elected Pope, everybody anticipated that he would be a very opposite to the ones coming before him, that he would be a very liberal Pope politically. That was the anticipation. Same thing happened with John Paul II. We will talk about that. John Paul II, as a young man, had been very, very liberal. He had been an actor in the theater. Did you know that? John Paul II? Yeah, that's why he looked so good in front of the camera. Oh, he knew how to pose. Same thing as Pius XII. So everybody anticipated that these men were going to be very, very liberal. Yes, anticipation, but no. It did not turn out to be that way. Initially, he declared amnesty for political prisoners. He appointed an advisory council with limited powers, which was scandalous. The Pope appointing an advisory council? The Pope doing that? No way. He authorized the Constitution. My goodness, an agreement between the ruler and the people? And secularized administration of the papal states. That is appointing lay people to positions like mayor, chief of police, head of budget, and the like, instead of having priests fill those positions. It was revolutionary in his first few months. Then the minister of the interior was assassinated during a riot. Very, very close to him. They were basically side by side, like we are here. And his minister of the interior was shot down, killed, died dead. He felt that he was not safe. So Pio Nono left Rome and went disguised to Gaeta. Gaeta is a small but nice port city between Rome and Naples. At that time, it belonged to the Kingdom of Naples. When you are really bored, you can look up Gaeta on Wikipedia or whatever, and read about the story of when the Pope was there in Gaeta. Gaeta belonged to the Kingdom of Naples. But all of a sudden, there are two kings in the Kingdom of Naples, the Pope and the King of Naples. So all the countries in Europe, England, France, Spain, they sent warships to Gaeta. What? To defend the Pope.
But during this assassination, was that actually an attack on the Pope? They tried to kill the Pope, or it was just an accident?
No, he was afraid. He was
No,
afraid.
the Minister of Interior was assassinated.
They were never, they may have been an attempt on the Pope's life. It may have been. Remember, they had been attempts on the
Yes.
Pope's life.
Was the assassin caught? Was the assassin caught?
Yeah, was he?
Was the assassin caught, captured?
I'm not sure, I don't think so.
So we don't know for
Yeah,
sure who he meant to kill.
They did a complete investigation and decided that nobody knew anything.
So isn't it?
That's something.
Big investigation. So, but the Pope fled Rome and he disguised himself as a priest and scrambled. And all those warships assembled in Gaeta from Spain and England and France and from the Empire. And everybody was afraid that a naval war was going to get started. Why? Because the Pope was there. The Pope wasn't threatening anybody. He was just there. In any event, the French finally came through and said, "Look, Pope, we'll take you back to Rome under our protection." So Pio Nono decided that he had to control the papal states, and the papacy had to be independent. And by controlling the papal state, he would also have financial support for the Vatican, for the papacy. This episode at Gaeta really changed his attitude completely, from being a very liberal monarch to being a very conservative and reactionary monarch. Now, Pio Nono was like a lady in one of the classes of literature that we have to give in the future. A lady who, every time she made a decision, she made the wrong choice. Every time. So did Pio Nono. Every time he had to do something, it was controversial. It was the wrong decision. These were the Immaculate Conception, the excommunication for the loss of the papal states, the Quanta Cura encyclical, the syllabus of errors. It's terrible. Then the First Vatican Council with the dogma of papal infallibility, culture counts, the struggle over culture in Germany, declaring himself a prisoner of the Vatican, and declining the law of guarantees.
Can you just drill down on the first one? Oh, we're going to do that here. Okay, hang on. I was curious about the Immaculate Conception. Was that not something that was
We're
adhered
going to go
to
over
prior?
this one by one. Thank you. Thank you. This is just an introduction to Pius IX. Pio Nono. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception reads or teaches that the Virgin Mary was conceived without any stain of original sin. This is what all Catholics are supposed to believe. All right? So, Pope Pius IX declares this as a dogma. No pope had ever declared a dogma before. Councils, ecumenical councils had declared dogmas, but the Pope had never declared a dogma before. He had consulted a number of bishops, mostly in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, which is like the president consulting Republicans nowadays. Of course, they're going to give you their point of view. No question about it. So the same thing, the bishops that answered the Pope were in favor of it. But there was no theological conflict. It was totally unnecessary. The dogma was proclaimed in 1854, probably as a reaction to the loss of the papal states. In other words, the Pope would tell you, look, you take away my lands, but I can tell you what to believe. If you don't believe, you go to hell when you die.
Yeah, you got to be a little careful, at least from a Catholic perspective, right? Because the Pope can only do that, and this is what Catholics believe, after deep prayer and communication with God. You can only do it on limited things. And it's actually considered not the Pope making the decision, but that being communicated by God to the Pope to express the faith.
Correct. That is the dogma of infallibility, to which will come shortly. But this was before there was infallibility.
Okay.
He did that on his own.
Okay.
He did that on his own, and he did that right after the loss of the papal states. And there was no doubt that it was primarily, maybe it was a devotion thing, a special devotion of his. It was to show that the Pope was super.
Trying to at that first bullet point, you're saying that the Virgin Mary was conceived without sin.
Yes.
So why was that?
Because they don't return,
Why was that important to add?
That was the argument.
that she was.
That's why it was ridiculed.
Remember that, right? Supposedly, after Adam and Eve, original sin, we're all born with that. And we have to be baptized, be cleansed of that. Mary is the only person born without original sin.
And Jesus.
Was there controversy about that? Was there discussion about that? They required them to actually say, oh, and by the way.
There's probably people that didn't believe. Well, to Ray's point,
That's
I don't think there was much controversy. He didn't have to say this because it was genuinely believed.
Yeah, that's the second bullet, but there was no conflict.
Yeah, the
It
faithful.
was just totally unnecessary. The good Pope brought this on himself. He could have waited until he got infallibility or until he got the council, but no, he went ahead on his own. So he had the power to tell the faithful what to believe. It implied infallibility because this was the first Pope. to ever declare a dogma. Politically, Pio Nono, Pius IX, didn't do much better. By 1860, most of Italy was unified, and the Papal States were lost. So the Pope excommunicated the king, Count Cavour, the Prime Minister Garibaldi, that was fighting in the south of Italy, and everybody associated with the loss of the Papal States. Catholics were also forbidden to vote, forbidden to hold offices, forbidden to cooperate with the government. So instead of Pio Nono, he became known as No Pio.
Because practically when Italy was unified, that followed the dissolution of the Austrian Empire. And that's probably the relationship with Vienna. So of course they're gonna be against unified.
No question about it.
What was that a picture? Oh.
Yeah.
No.
The emperor,
It was,
the king.
But if he had not done enough harm, he published the Quanta Cura encyclical and the syllabus of errors. And this is what history says, that no enemy of the papacy could have caused half as much harm as he did with the syllabus. It confirmed his reputation as an absolute monarch and a reactionary.
Can you please tell me what is the syllabus of there? I'm really not familiar with this.
Yeah, we're coming to it. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
These are some of the syllabus of errors. We have two slides on the syllabus of errors. These are statements that the Pope declared as wrong. All right? These are in error, according to the Pope.
Were these in some other documents?
Absolutely.
Were these errors something that were other documents that he was saying, no, this is true?
No, these are directly from the one before. These are directly from the encyclical. He listed all the statements that were, in his opinion, wrong.
So these statements were coming from,
Other people, or from observations, or every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which he shall consider true. So there is no freedom of religion. The church does not have the power of using force, direct or indirect. In other words, the church can use force. The immunity of the church derives its origins from civil law. That is wrong. According to Pius IX, the immunity of the church, power of the church comes from God. The Roman pontiffs or the popes have contributed to the division of the church into Eastern and Western. No, it was not the fault of the Roman church. Yes, but the abolition of the temporal power of the papacy will contribute greatly to the liberty and prosperity of the church. That is wrong. We need to have temporal power of the papacy. We need to have income from all those territories. It is no longer expedient that Catholicism should be held as the only religion of the state. That is wrong. Catholicism should be the one and only religion of the state. The Pope can and should reconcile himself and come to terms with progress, liberalism, modern civilization. No, the Pope doesn't have to do that. The Pope can forget modern civilization, liberalism, progress, modernity, everything. On and on and on and on and on. These are only a sample.
this is mostly a reaction to the French.
They were very reactionary.
So that point you can revolution.
Then in the midst of what you can just imagine the reaction of newspapers and schools and colleges and politicians in Europe, particularly in England, that were anti-papacy to begin with. Then he calls the First Vatican Council. The First Vatican Council at that time was the Vatican Council because the second had not even been planned. Was supposed to condemn contemporary errors. He had already condemned them, now he wanted a council to condemn them. Rationalism, liberalism, and materialism, and consolidate the authority of the papacy. This approach to the papacy is called ultramontanism. Ultramontanism is beyond the mountains. The people in Europe were being exposed to this expression of power coming from beyond the mountains that divide Europe from the rest of from Italy. The ultramontanism consisted of two things: centralization of power in the papacy, number two, the strengthening of papal authority. The First Vatican Council had a number of documents, including the dogmatic constitution of the faith and the dogmatic constitution of the Church of Christ. They said things like God is personal. In other words, God is not energy. God is not power. God is not an idea. God is person. Person. All right. God is known to man by reason and revelation. Faith is a supernatural virtue. All of these things are pretty bland, and sure, most people will accept them. The Constitution of the Church of Christ gets more to the point. The primacy of the Pope, permanence of the primacy, the power of the Pope, and number four, the infallible teaching authority of the papacy. That was in the dogmatic constitution of the Church of Christ. And this is what you were referring to before. This is a straight quotation from the document. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra, that is, from the Church of Peter, exhibiting authority concerning faith and morals, he is possessed of the infallibility that Jesus wishes the church should be endowed with concerning faith and morals. And implied in this statement is that when the statement is made, it has to be made very clear that the Pope is speaking ex cathedra, is speaking from the chair of Peter, is speaking directly as the prime teacher of the Church of Christ.
Is this something that is still
Mhm.
accepted nowadays?
Mhm.
And they really let the Pope believe that somebody talks to him?
Yeah.
The interesting thing was that in the 150 years, this has 160 years, it has been used once.
Right. It's very judiciously used, which is what leads to
Which is when?
its credibility.
So infallibility has been invoked once.
Like when? For the Virgin Mary?
From Pope Pius XII. We'll get to that next week. So it's good that you are so involved in this. You're anticipating things. That's what's wonderful.
So,
No, because it's something that it's not, nowadays you can't just accept something like that. Okay. Whatever. I mean, if you go and say that somebody talks to you, people will think, like, you think you're possessed. So they will question.
That's
No.
so there's one.
Well, I mean, even as a Catholic, you will question. I mean, it doesn't really matter which faith you are gonna start thinking at some point.
So there's one issue that many Catholics held their breath on for a long time, waiting to hear whether it would be considered infallible or not. And that's on the issue of birth control. This has never been used. Now, the Catholic professes to be against artificial birth control, but it's never proclaimed it as valid.
But even
Because most Catholics believe
the-
perfect.
even the conception, the immaculate conception of Christ between one and Virgin Mary is a type of birth control or imposing a birth, whatever. So why they would even question that? For me,
Oh, okay.
somebody else controls
So
that somebody gets pregnant.
there's certain things, right? She was born without sin, which is,
Conception.
no, that's different. There was immaculate conception, i.e. Christ developed within her without being pregnant. That was the immaculate conception, but that's different than Mary was the only human being born without original sin.
Okay.
That's a different thing, because God had already ordained that she would be the mother of Christ.
I understand
Oh.
it, but I mean, just the fact, like, if you start talking within the church that somebody was born this way or that way, not in the way like a natural person,
Right.
that's a kind of birth control. Whether you want to accept it or not. So why would you be against birth
The
control?
worst of faith.
Yeah, but I mean, right, no,
It's a question.
They have to repeat the question of
this
this.
is all built on faith, right? And that is,
I understand.
So
Yeah.
you can
That's
imagine
great.
how in the middle of the Vatican Council, the bishops approved this constitution declaring the Pope infallible. This was taken and ridiculed all over Europe. Here's the Pope cutting himself off in the 19th century. And here the Pope and the bishops treading water, ready to fall in. They had a heyday. With the cartoons are innumerable about how much the Pope and the statement of infallibility was lampooned in the 19th century.
Is the fact that it was only used once a recognition by the church that it was highly controversial?
No.
No, the fact that it was only used once, you said, that's some indication that the church found it would be very controversial whenever it was.
no, I think it's actually interpreted as why it's valid, because it has been used very judiciously.
I see. So when it is used,
At least I'll tell you, that's how I feel.
but like something like birth control, not exactly, well, I mean, everybody didn't march to that tune,
Right.
which suggests that fallible, it was not accepted that way.
We're gonna
Well,
get to
we can see
the,
what the issue is.
Okay.
we're gonna get to the assumption, which is the dogma that was again, not without controversy.
But at that time, what they're saying is that all of his decisions were,
No.
at that time.
He did not, he just issued the fact that he could do it, but none of this, that stuff, if that was the case, most of us would have left.
You weren't around yet.
I wasn't around yet, but I think there would be very.
So just to have the right to have, just that's what you're saying.
It's just the right,
Okay,
right, all those crazy things he said.
okay.
Well, the end result was that the authority of the Pope was assertively presented. And infallibility was proclaimed at the expense of a lot of criticism, ridicule, counter-reaction, and sustained wave of anti-clericalism. And this really shaped the 19th century, second part of the 19th century in Europe. And we can see a lot of anti-Catholic, anti-religious, anti-papal canons throughout Europe at the end of the 19th century. In many countries, not just in Italy, Germany, France, Spain, England, the northern countries have been lost in the papacy for a long time. So many of the things that we see in books like the Brothers Karamazov, in books like Misericordia, in books like some of Dickens' books, were really precipitated by this wave of anti-clericalism.
This, just one additional questions, my mind.
Yeah.
But this acceptance that he could be infallible if he chose to make a statement, does that sort of put him above sort of kings? You know, in other words, he was a king among kings, so to speak,
Right.
and now all of a sudden he was demoted because the country consolidated. He had a much smaller kingdom, I guess. Did this kind of put him above that? You know, like
Certainly, that's
none of the kings had infallibility,
No,
presumably.
Absolutely. I mean, because what, at least my understanding is what it means is he is speaking for God. And so God definitely is above king. Trump may not agree, but
Yeah, so that kind of makes sense, though, from a political point of view.
right, which is why I think a lot of kings and so on are concerned about
Yeah.
Catholic Church. But like I said,
Right.
it's been used very judiciously.
But what was the reaction of other Christians at that point? Well, if you say that you're the only one who can talk to God, what about other Christians?
Oh, he's not
I'm not
saying he's
even
the only
mentioning other
one.
religions.
I'm not saying he's the only one. It's just saying that when he uses the infallibility, he is speaking for God. Because he is God's representative on earth.
I understand that, but that's what I said, like what Luther says, I can talk to God too.
Yeah, absolutely he can.
And whatever, Muhammad can to God.
Yep, absolutely.
Let me point something out here that it's seldom written in the history books. When this Constitution on the Church of Christ was being approved by the Vatican Council, about 40% of the bishops that were going to vote on it asked for a legal absence
Oh, really?
Or they wouldn't have to vote.
so that they would not, number one, be there and have to vote no, or be there and have to vote yes, because they really did not believe that it was necessary. So there was considerable discrepancy as to what to believe amongst the ranks. And for that reason, and for many others, that's why it came upon so much criticism and ridicule. Part of the reaction to the dogma was culture correction, the struggle for culture, primarily in what is now Germany. It was certainly a reaction to papal infallibility. The different states closed liberal offices. Priests were forbidden from preaching on political subjects. All schools were subject to state inspection. Religious teachers were excluded from state schools. Once again, the Jesuits were dissolved and expelled. They always get the wrong end of the shaft. They come in, they go out, they come in, they go out.
Sort of like the breeze of.
Diplomatic relations with the papacy were severed. Every marriage had to be performed by a judge. So if a couple wanted to be married in church, sure, you can get married in church, but you also have to go to a judge or a notary public or somebody to get married. And finally, the state assumed training over religious, assumed control over religious training and appointments. The story of the First Vatican Council is interesting because it really never closed until way after. The Kingdom of Italy captured Rome on September 20th, And the First Vatican Council suspended its sessions indefinitely 1 month afterwards. So it was certainly, the Vatican Council was certainly a victim for ultramontanism, papal authority, and centralization. On the other hand, the Pope became a prisoner of the Vatican. That is, he felt very, very unsafe outside of the Vatican. And he probably was unsafe outside the Vatican. Because not only had he been the object of an assassination attempt once, but he had become more and more and more and more in Italy because he was against reunification. He was very popular outside Italy, but not inside it. So Pio Nono felt very uncomfortable outside of the Vatican and never really went out. The Italian government passed the law of guarantees, which recognized many privileges for the Pope: diplomatic privileges, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, travel, various properties, including Castel Gandolfo in the mountains outside Rome. But the Pope would not leave the Vatican. He was really the last Pope. He was the last one that was both a temporal ruler and a spiritual leader. He never accepted the specifications of the government, of the law guarantees. Because he said, look, you can guarantee me these things right now, but you can come back next week and take them away. So he was the last king pope, Pope Pius IX. He could not accept the loss of the papal states. He did not feel safe. But seen outside Italy as a humble, amiable, and frugal man, he had showed dignified defiance. His popularity increased, contributions surged from outside Italy. But the papacy was politically isolated and marginalized. The worst question always comes up: has history judged him too harshly? Well, maybe. He was a man of his time, probably of the early 19th century. And we live in our time, right now, the 21st century. Certainly looked at things from different points of view. He wanted to maintain the temporal holdings of the church. He did not want to lose all that income. He did not want to be dependent on other kingdoms for income and for protection. He wanted to maintain some independence for the things.
But don't they have that? And you said he was last king pope, so what is now the pope considered? Because we still have a pope state, very much institutionalized, so much more.
We will get to that in our next lesson when the Concordat with Mussolini takes place. But as far as being pope and king of a small kingdom, he was the last one. All right, let's wait there. Industrial Revolution. That's where we start next.
Is it very
Thank you so very much. Thank you.